really was the way I wanted to live my life, to set my own intellectual projects and to pursue them deeply and dedicate my life to learning. Academia had claimed me so much and had made me into a very particular kind of worker with a particular understanding of what professional success felt like and meant and the way I wanted to work. There was just no way anything else could claim me.
Hi everyone, it's Jo. You're listening to Occupational Hazards, a series of candid conversations with some of the most inspiring people I know as they share their path to finding their calling and all the gritty realities of their jobs. Whether you want to demystify your dream job or are someone like me who enjoys getting a peek into other people's work lives, then this is the podcast for you. Our next guest has made it her life's work to study and contextualize the past, something many of us can learn from, especially as we look to the patterns of history to make sense of today's headlines. Dr. Nicole CuUnjieng Aboitiz is an historian and a scholar whose research interests center on global intellectual history, as well as Southeast Asian environmental, cultural, and political history. Nicole has received fellowships to pursue these research interests at various institutions of higher learning. For those outside the world of academia, a fellowship is a monetary award and merit-based affiliation at an institution for the advanced study of an academic subject. So working in the UK, she is currently a research fellow at Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge and an institute fellow at the Institute for Transnational and Spatial History at the University of St. Andrews. She was formerly a postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University and holds a PhD with distinction in Southeast Asian and International History from Yale University. Nicole serves as executive director of the Toynbee Prize Foundation, which recognizes outstanding work in global history. Other experiences include being an opinion columnist for the Manila Times, working in the office of the chief economist in the Philippines' Department of Finance, and co-founding Pampublico, a political think tank that aimed to shift Philippine political conversations away from personality politics and towards substantive policy discussion, a very worthy endeavor. Nicole recently published her first book, Asian Place, Filipino Nation, a global intellectual history of the Philippine Revolution, 1887 to 1912, via Columbia University Press, with a Philippine edition via Ateneo de Manila University Press. So if Kevin Bacon has 6 degrees of separation, this woman has 6 degrees of education and counting. And she makes it all look effortless with her brand of surfer calm. Here's Nicole. Hi, Nicole.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I think that as we look back on the year that was, I had so many questions as to how you can kind of connect that to your work. But I guess to start off, where are you in your pandemic arc?
My pandemic arc coincided with my maternity leave arc. So I've been sort of out of joint in terms of space and time in many ways. And, having a different relationship with my space, my own body, and time more generally. So I'm sort of being reborn into this new Zoom world, which I wasn't part of for the last year. So that's the best way to summarize where I am.
Welcome to the Zoom world. I think it's a world that not many of us want to continue living in for a long time, but we're learning to live in this world right now. Congratulations, by the way, on birthing both your biological baby and your academic baby. I'm in the middle of reading Asian Place, Filipino Nation, and I have a couple of questions for you about it later. But I guess, hearing the overview of your work, how would you describe in your own words what you do? Like, what does an average day, if there is one, look like for you?
Unfortunately, if I think about my work is centered mostly on books, which it is right now, because I'm teaching in a more reduced way at Cambridge. It's a very long time scale, so it's not a day. Unfortunately, it took 7 years to write the first book, And the current book I'm working on will, likely take another 7 years, if not longer. So I guess you just have to learn to think over long stretches, basically alone. In the humanities, academics mostly work alone. That's the mainstay. And the life of a scholar is quite quiet. And you have your own little fiefdom. You don't have to worry about working in a team or anything like that. And it's kind of your own intellectual project. So it's setting out a question you have of the world around you and pursuing it to the highest degree of rigor that you can, and using it as a way to further the state of our learning and understanding on a topic, and sort of carving out new understandings, new kinds of knowledge production and knowledge preservation, and being part of a community of scholars committed to doing the same things from their own little fiefdoms. We all do something a little bit different. There are very few of us who work on exactly the same thing from in the same angle.
How did you actually stumble upon or come to discover your research interests? Because you talk a lot about global intellectual history, Pan-Asianism, Southeast Asian studies. Maybe you could talk about how you came to appreciate these, and in layman's terms, how you would explain it to somebody from outside this world.
Yeah, so global intellectual history is basically the intellectual thought and history of ideas of people outside the West or interacting with the West. So if formerly intellectual history, when you would go to universities, mostly in the West, but all over the world, you would learn about Descartes and Kant and Nietzsche all the way up and down the line, right? And it was basically a Western tradition that you were taught. And then if you wanted to learn about, great non-Western thinkers, it would usually be within sort of civilizational area studies. So, you would learn about Confucius when you were looking at sort of China and the Sinic world, and, more modern, maybe like Tagore when you're looking at South Asia. But those kept those big thinkers within their civilizational units. And global intellectual history looks at the work and the thought of people outside the West, but tries to integrate it into a larger intellectual tradition, so you don't have to have them so separated. So yeah, that's my main field is global intellectual history, and I try to see the history of ideas as not so reified and exceptionalized between different corners of the world, and see the ways in which they do respond to one another, communicate with another, and can echo and amplify one another if you want to. And yeah, I started doing Southeast Asian history because it was a natural fit, given I'm from the Philippines and I was living in the US at the time with no concrete plans to move home. And so it was a way to orient myself deeply and rigorously to the region without living there. And it would bring me back to Southeast Asia, yearly to do research. And so it seemed to me like a sort of deeper way to be in connection with the region I came from, and to continue to understand it even from a remove, at least in some parts of my life.
Sure. What about Pan-Asianism, if you had to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I got super fascinated by Pan-Asianism when I was starting my doctorate, because I read this book by Jamil Aiden, who is one of my intellectual heroes, and it is called The Politics of Anti-Westernism in Pan-Islamism and Pan-Asianism. So that book was just so stunning to me to see the ways in which he analyzed the crumbling of a sort of Eurocentric world order in discourse and thought prior to its actual demise in structure. And it was talking about the crisis of contradictions and exclusion within the late 19th, early 20th century, when sort of the non-Western world came up against the sort of universal Enlightenment ideals and promises of the West, and found that that beneath the universal rhetoric was a very particularized barrier. So the universal ideals of the West were understood as being brought about and properly belonging to a white Christian people. And that was sort of the basis of their achievement and also the natural ambit of their application. And so coming up against these sort of racist barriers to what were supposedly universal ideals moved thinkers in the Middle East and in Japan and China to come up with an alternative sort of worldview and world order. And that's where you get the Pan-Asianism and Pan-Islamism of this time period.
Sure. Actually, to touch on something you said earlier, when global just means non-Western or more inclusive, in terms of the what is being studied and whose voices get heard. I think one of the big themes of 2020, I was listening to a BBC podcast on history, and they said, 2020 surprised no historians because if you look at a long-term view, it's really just a reckoning, or it's kind of society coming to understand the consequences of events that have been unleashed, centuries before, decades before, specifically with, maybe the climate crisis and encroachment of humans into the natural world, like the response to colonialism or the decolonization, as well as the rise of, China in this like bipolar or multipolar world that we're now living in. So there are so many things. I think that having that lens by which you view the world would be useful to understand current events. I guess in terms of how the pandemic has affected the work that you do on a day-to-day basis, what does that look like? Because I know you do a lot of research. So previously you would be flying to different universities around the world, looking at their archives. How has that affected the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, it's made archival work, on the one hand, it's been a boon for a lot of academics in the global south who don't have the privilege of flying all over the world to different archives in different countries and doing kind of more global history. That's been the province of scholars who have the good fortune to have the research funds to do those kinds of things, and universities that support them. But so one thing that the pandemic has done in this sort of online world is it's moved a lot of libraries to move faster in terms of digitizing their collections and making things available online more widely. So in some ways, it's been good. But of course, in many ways, the disconnection between the different sites in which you're working and also the inability to access books and archives is very real and has put a lot of research, the kind of research I do at least, on hold in many ways. Also, I think for other academics who work with human subjects, whether it's oral history or anthropology, the kind of border crossing, real interaction with other peoples in a close, intimate way over long periods is impossible at this point. So I think that there have been some positive things to come out of it, but then there have been, obviously, like many other professions, a lot of big barriers. And I think that it is nice, though, to see the ways in which a lot of people have put, so at the Toynbee Prize Foundation, a foundation I work at, we had a couple of guides on like how to research maritime early modern Spanish empires from home. And there are a lot of cool things like that happening where you can do more from where you're sitting. And that's good, not just for us academics, but even for, say, undergraduates who are studying history or other subjects. They can do more primary source work early on and engage more deeply with real historical analysis.
Sure. Would you say that it's impacted budgets and for PhD programs as well as, grants?
Definitely. The humanities was already being defunded in many ways for many reasons that we don't have to go into here. And it's already not a very bright spot in terms of what your career prospects look like. And when you first invited me to do this podcast, I mentioned to you that it's not something that we really recommend people to do anymore, is to think of themselves as having, a long, full sort of tenured track career in the humanities as a professor, because that kind of academic path has been very unstable for very long. And there's a move to using adjunct sort of contractual teaching contracts in the humanities. And this pandemic has only made that process much more aggrieved and intensified, I believe. There are still jobs out there, but they're very few, and there are more PhDs produced every year than can possibly take up the very, very few positions. And also positions that are opened, are tenure track and held for life. So you have to wait another lifetime before that position opens up again, usually. So it's not an easy job market. And I don't think that us moving to largely online education in the past year will portend well for the full flourishing of the humanities in the way that we knew it before. Perhaps new ways will open up, but there were a lot of worrying trends already.
In terms of, I guess, since you brought it up, this is not necessarily a track that you would recommend in today's climate/economy, but how did you get into it personally? Because you must have been influenced by, certain classes you took or people that you met early on in your life. Like, can you maybe talk about your origin story, how you found your way into this career, and then maybe some other career paths you considered along the way?
Yeah, I sort of considered everything at one point in time. So I worked at a international fashion label. I worked at the Met Museum in New York. I worked at an art collective. I worked at a law firm in the Philippines. I worked at 2 different investment banks. I did a little bit of everything. I worked at a newspaper, and I kind of hated everything, and I just didn't like it, and nothing was a good fit. And at first, I thought I was just sort of being spoiled and like moving around a lot and kind of restless. But it always came back to the idea that the only thing I really wanted to do with my life, and the only thing I really loved, was being a student. And I happened to be really good at academic research and scholarship. And I was doing it as an undergraduate before I even really knew what I was doing. It was kind of a sort of natural thing that just came out of me. And I was working at the time in New York at an advertising agency, and it got to the point where I was so ashamed of the work I was doing that I didn't even tell people when I would go to parties what I did. I just wanted to ask questions of the world around me, big questions, and I wanted to think more deeply about lots of issues which plagued me and which interested me. And so then I also had a lot of PhD friends. My best friends from college, basically like half of us became PhD students around this time, and all in different fields. So I had a lot of models around me for how you could do it, and we all helped one another, and we didn't compete in any way because you're all in different fields. So yeah, I mean, in the Philippines, it's not a very well-known career path. It's not something that your parents tell you to do, except for, a handful of different families I know. It's not something that's known as a sort of mainstream career. So I had a lot of models amongst my friends, and so I did it and found that that was exactly what I had wanted to do. And it really was the way I wanted to live my life, to set my own intellectual projects and to pursue them deeply on my own and dedicate my life to learning and knowledge. And yeah, so then I got the PhD, and halfway through, I mean, anyone who does a PhD will tell you that it's love hate. It's never all perfect, and you go through really, really severe roller coasters within it. And almost everyone at some point will think of getting out, and I definitely did think of getting out. And I looked into being a public servant and working in government, which is how I ended up doing a stint at the Department of Finance here in the Philippines. Working for the Office of the Chief Economist and the Adjunct Office of the Strategy and Research Group, what was formerly known as SURGE. And yes, I did that for a little bit, but also that was not a good fit for me. And I realized after doing that academia had claimed me so much and had made me into a very particular kind of worker with a particular understanding of what professional success felt like and meant, and the way I wanted to work. And after so long in academia, there was just no way anything else could claim me. So I went quickly back into the fold. And then started at Harvard and Cambridge. And I've been here ever since, and I know now better than to think about leaving.
You mentioned you were in a program back at school with other people who went on to get their PhDs. Was this in the history program at Penn?
No, this is just my best friends.
Okay.
My group of best friends.
Okay, because you said you're all in different fields. Maybe you can talk about some of the other tracks available, or what are other people doing with the PhDs that they kind of earned?
So we're a really bad set, I think, in terms of giving you the examples, but we're all in different fields, from philosophy to economics to history, physics, and we're all in academia. We didn't do anything else. We're deeply within the ivory tower.
Okay. Before you got your PhD, so you also got a master's in philosophy and a master of the arts in Southeast Asian and international history, right?
No, actually, I went straight from the undergrad to the PhD, and then just en route to the PhD, Yale awarded me these 2 other degrees because I'd fulfilled the requirements for those, but sure. I was just doing the PhD. But yeah, they threw me those because I fulfilled the requirements for them. But
understood. Okay, yeah. That's why I was making the joke about all the degrees, but no, it makes sense. I guess for somebody outside the academic world, it would look like a lot of studying, like a lot of time spent gaining these degrees. But if you look back at what you were like when you were younger, were there certain aspects of what your personality was like that made you a good fit for studying history or being an academic?
Probably that I don't do well in teamwork. That's probably a pretty good fit. And yeah, I guess a general sense of like intensity and independence. But no, I never thought of this as a career path when I was little. I didn't really know of it as a career path. So I was lucky that I was around people who helped me see it as such, and that I was at universities that prized research so much.
Yeah. If you had to describe what you did to somebody, in terms of the highs of the job and then maybe the lows, can you walk us through like the best of the best and then the lowest of the low?
Yeah, the best of the best is probably like when you're in a seminar or in a colloquium and you're sort of going head to head with other people, other scholars about a certain idea, arguing and thinking it through and sort of battling. And it's a very kind of it's a particular kind of high. And it comes from a certain place of rigor. And that's part of what the high is, where you're trying to find the the flaws and the gaps and the inconsistencies in someone else's argument or proposition, and they're doing the same to you. And then when you get a whole room of people doing it to one another, it's really invigorating, and it feels amazing because it also feels like that's our productive work, I guess. When if we're otherwise sort of solitary scholars, is coming together with this community of scholars and the way in which we keep each other in check. So we work alone, but your arguments will never stand against your peers if they are not sound. And we do the work of sort of policing one another's sort of rigor and methods and interpretations. And we make sure that, we sort of safeguard, I guess, the knowledge production to make sure it is rigorous. And so we're held to account. And it's a sort of like a battle in a little way, but also collaboration. And it's very peculiar. And it's very rough if if you aren't used to it. But the PhD sort of gets you acculturated to it. And you get this really sort of thick skin where it's like sort of minds interacting rather than persons. So it's not personal. So yeah, that's a particular kind of high because it also feels fun and feels like real time in a certain way when so much of what we do takes so long to come out and is really kind of ignored by most of society. So it can when you're with others who are doing what you do and who take so seriously the things that you write and things that they write themselves, it's a good feeling. In terms of the lows, I mean, there are so many lows. I think that the job market itself is a huge low. The ways in which universities are being remade by sort of financial interests that highlight, like, the business schools and things like that. And, universities moving to treat students more like clients, rather than students. So we're sort of servicing them, I think, is a real disservice to their education and a disservice to the work that the professors and other academics do within the university, and the expertise that they have. And also, I guess, the fact that, really what we're doing is in many ways fairly niche, and it can feel like you're sort of talking to yourself only. And in many ways, you're supposed to be talking to yourself, but because of the way in which you're meant to write for other academics, and then it's specific projects where you end up branching out and being invited to speak to a wider public. But first, you get groomed to talk to one another and to the existing literature.
What would you say are maybe some of the biggest barriers to representation and participation in the field of academia, along maybe gender lines, like for women, and racial lines, class lines, maybe?
I mean, all of those. I think that, for a long time, being an academic was basically like a leisure occupation. Those who were wealthy enough had time to sit around and think all day. And that's been a hangover for a very long time. But then it became a sort of white old boys club in the highest sort of seats of learning, which also are correlated again with global power. So there's a reason why we know of the famous universities in Europe rather than the famous ancient universities in India globally, right? When we think about the history of higher learning. So yeah, there's every single kind of barrier to privilege that you see more broadly in society is represented also in academia.
Yeah. Do you think it's changed in the time since you've worked in the field? Like, you being in the field of Southeast Asian studies, somebody actually from Southeast Asia, like, and a woman at that. I think when I look at, I've never been in the world of academia, but I do remember seeing who was on the panels at different discussions when I would look at like posters for events, and they tended to be kind of a particular demographic, like you mentioned. Is that changing?
I mean, I think that people are more conscious now of needing to have diversity, especially in the US, on different panels and conferences and things like that. And you usually don't in the US organize a big conference panel that has just like all white men on it. You have to, and actually there's a move to do much more diversification than one normally thinks of outside academia. So on a panel, you should have, if you really do think about diversity and representation properly, not just the Ivy Leagues, but also state schools, as well as smaller liberal arts college represented, as well as different stages of career. So a tenure professor, a PhD student, a postdoc, a junior professor, and then gender, and also not just white. So that is getting better, especially in the US. And it's more of a conversation globally as well.
Do you think part of it has to do maybe with also the funding available? As you mentioned, like certain countries, I think, do a better job, or from what I gather from what you said, certain countries do a better job maybe funding this field of study, preserving the archives, probably the former colonial powers. Therefore, there are more resources available to people living in those countries as well. Because I'm just trying to put it in the kind of Asian context, like a country such as the Philippines, where we both live, and kind of just comparing and contrasting the resources available as well as the push to enter those fields. And I could kind of see why more people might go into academia in a country such as, the US or one of the European countries.
Yeah, of course. It's like a nice to have, not a need to have, depending on what other pressing funding priorities and responsibilities you have in a country. So to me, it seems perfectly natural. That said, there's still room for different cultures to have different priorities for whatever reason. So the Philippines is one where historical memory is very short and is not forefront. And there are lots of dedicated, wonderful public historians in the Philippines who do a lot of work. But yeah, funding is slow going and it's never a top priority. I also understand why it's not top priority. It makes sense. We have a lot more urgent, pressing issues. So even I wouldn't divert funds that are needed elsewhere here in the Philippines for public history. Yeah, but I would say even like if you look at the US, it's the big universities that have either sufficient government funding or sufficient endowments are the ones that are able to support the humanities and support the kind of global research that I do, which costs a little bit more because of the travel. So I guess what I was saying before is more about global history, because you can do lots of domestic history on the cheap. History, to write history is not very expensive, actually. The entrance fee to an archive, into a library is usually zero. And it's mostly your time. And it's about whether you can make a living doing it.
So speaking of, whether you can make a living, I think a lot of people before they would enter this field are wondering if it really is for them. So if you had to kind of fill in this blank, to tell somebody who is considering this as a career path, don't take this or don't pursue this career if you blank, what would you put in those blanks?
Oh man. Okay, if I'm defining it as being an academic working in academia and the humanities, I would say don't go down this career path if you want to choose where you live. The academic job market is such that once a position opens in your field, it can be in a city you've never heard of in the middle of nowhere, and that's the only opening in your field that year. And you're going to fight for it. And that's what's going to be the best position that year. And another position won't open up perhaps for many years. So if you want to choose where you live, then don't do it. I mean, you can choose where you live if you don't care about being paid. But if you care about being paid and you care about where you live, don't do it.
What would you do differently if you could go back in time? Would you give certain advice to your younger self?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same advice that most people give, which would just be to study more languages earlier. It really, there's nothing like being inside of a language to be able to access a new thought world and thought worlds and understanding different ways of being and being able to go deeper within that. So yeah, that would be my advice to myself.
Now, how many languages do you read or speak right now?
Mostly just Spanish, Tagalog, and English. At one point, I was able to read French, but that's I've lost that. And at many different points, I I tried during the PhD to acquire a second Southeast Asian language, and those plans just dissolved and fizzled.
Okay. In terms of accessibility, which you touched on earlier, or kind of bringing this to a wider audience, I think I really appreciated that you made your book available via Ateneo de Manila University Press so that there was a local edition as well. So if I were like a teacher in the Philippines, wanting to introduce your book to history students since it's available, what would be your like elevator pitch for the book in terms of what this will add to their understanding of our Philippine history?
So if it's a Philippine history class, then I have a sort of different pitch than if it's a non-Philippine history
Maybe you
class.
could do both, because I think we have listeners from both worlds.
So for Philippine history, it's an easy sell. It's basically it's a revisionist understanding of the most famous history that the Philippines has, which is of the Philippine Revolution and the founding of the nation state. And I didn't uncover new sources that were never seen before. I went back to the same traditional sources that we've all used and looked at for the last 100 years. And yet I was able to produce a completely different interpretation than the ones that we've been given. And so I think it's an important moment to sort of think through what did our past narratives occlude and why. And I think that it's important to sort of rebalance the understanding that we have of the Philippine Revolution and the founding of the Philippine nation state within thinking of the Philippines as part of Asia. So that's would be my pitch for a Philippine historical audience. And then globally, I tend to think through more about the peripheral side to Pan-Asianism, rather than thinking of Pan-Asianism from the center of Japan and China, and what does Asia look like from the periphery, and thinking through the kind of alternative visions of world order and visions of the political that were in contest during a very global moment of imperial consolidation and sort of rebellions of resistance and subversive activity that was remaking the globe, especially in Asia in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Where would you say that this idea of the Filipino self-image as non-Asian, excluded from the region of Southeast Asia, maybe more akin to Latin America, where did this notion come from, especially in the way it was taught in the Philippine context? Because I've been thinking back on how I learned history, and there was never really a strong effort to connect us to regional neighbors, except when we studied Southeast Asian history.
Yeah, so I think it has been natural to sort of do the interpretation from the top down. So to look at basically the colonial powers and their cultures and thought worlds, and then the elites who sort of work within that colonial structure and then end up filling the role of the colonial powers as sort of just the next elite group. So that kind of belonging ends up referring mostly to Spain and to the US. And then it makes the comparison to Latin America very natural. And it is a good comparison. I don't think that it's just not the only comparison that there is. And there are subterranean networks and longer histories knitting the Philippines to Asia that didn't go away just because, of a few Spanish colonial administrators and, and priests scattered throughout. And there are many ways in which the Spanish influence is actually fairly thin. And then the American colonial regime is very good at co-opting that revolutionary zeal that you see so strongly in the Philippine Revolution and the desire for self-determination, co-opting it and basically funneling it and channeling it through their benevolent assimilation tutelage. And then with the rise of the US in the 20th century, it becomes more and more like a realpolitik kind of calculation on the part of the Philippines to use that special relationship in the international and in terms of geopolitics. So it's a sort of a natural outgrowth of, machinations and phenomena in the rest of the world. But that also doesn't negate a very interesting and complicated relationship with Asia more broadly that continues to undergird the 20th century for the Philippines. There's third worldism, pan-Malayism, there's the experiment with Mafilindo, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, and there's also a lot of Asianist critique, even from the sidelines, that lasts throughout the whole of the 20th century. And remains a foundation of thinking about what it means to be Malay that sits on top of, lots of sailors and merchants and diasporas that continue to knit the Philippines to the rest of Asia and always have.
Yeah, so I think it would definitely be, or the work that you've done, giving that alternative perspective is definitely a way to round out our self-image and the way we think about kind of identity, as well as how we were thinking or how our top minds, quote unquote, I know your research focuses a bit more on, say, the ilustrados or the educated elite who went to different countries and studied, but this is, I think, critical for our understanding of how the nation was coming together at that point in history.
Yeah, and there are other ways to look at it too without looking only at the elite and the ilustrados and the katipuneros. You can look at it from the perspective of Mindanao and in the Sulu zone that's always been connected to the Malay world. You can look at it from the perspective of sailors. You can look at it from the perspective of merchants. Those are other books that also should be written to include all of this, or even traveling doctors, nurses, scientists. So, yeah.
Do we have archives? Because I think with the ilustrados, they wrote a lot of letters. They had, the propagandists had La Solidaridad and all that. Therefore, it was easier to go back and look at their writings. But for those other groups, if somebody wanted to study it from their perspective, from the perspective of Muslim Mindanao or from the merchants and the sailors, are there actually materials available that one can study?
Yeah, and there are scholars definitely who do. Those are active sites of study. As with everything, a lot of the best records were kept by the colonial power. So you just have to learn how to read against the grain, we call it, and try and see through sort of the archive, not what the colonial powers thought interesting, but to see through to the subjects you care about and see what they sort of accidentally tell you about those perspectives.
So if we were to do a quick break from occupational hazards, because I think you've given us a really full picture of what your life as an academic is like, I'd like to kind of shift a bit more into recommended reading that you would have for the audience. It doesn't have to be history related. I know that you read a wide variety of things, but for people that are maybe have a bit of time now, what do you suggest we should be reading?
So this is unfortunately a work of history, but one of the best books I read over 2020 was called The Transformation of the World by Jürgen Osterhammel. And it's a really, really magnificent book about the 19th century and about all the changes that it wrought. And it does a truly global take. And it's not just like high politics. It starts with I think 5 paragraphs on opera around the world. And the way in which this art form captured certain imaginations from China, to France. And I think it also does a really good job of bringing in terms of looking at the dislocations and changes and transformations of the 19th century, wider perspectives than those usually represented, and putting them all together next to one another. He's an expert on China, but is German, and he's able to bring together lots of different threads in the most masterful, expert way.
Nice. Okay, I'll put that on the list. What about podcasts that you're listening to?
Oof, I'm really bad at podcasts because I'm like a really classic academic. I basically listen to podcasts that are just articles read aloud.
Okay.
So I wouldn't recommend them to anyone other than myself. So maybe pass on that question.
I think what we'll do is we'll link to a podcast you did where you talk about your book, since we're not able to go and do a deep dive right now. I like the one you did with your fellow surfer academic.
Michael Van.
Yes. Okay, what about a favorite work of fiction? Like it could be a movie or a book or anything else, featuring somebody in your profession? Because people can't become what they don't see, right? So if there are any...
Well, so, I love the old Woody Allen movies. And I know that's a controversial thing to say now. So all of his 1970s and 90s, 80s films at some point will show an academic. There's always an academic in conversation, even if it's just at a party in those films. And so those are my favorite.
Any particular fictional character that you most identify with?
My answer to that has always been Count Nikolai Rostov from War and Peace. When he comes on the scene in the book, he's sort of a university student and like 20 years old, and he just thinks he knows everything, and he's so sure of himself and his plans, and he doesn't realize how foolish and how young and immature he is. And I think that's me.
What about a talent or superpower that you wish you had?
Flying, and then I could get over my fear of heights.
Okay. So if people wanted to look up, your next book or your next topics of research, what would be the best way to do that? How can they find you kind of online?
Oh, well, my next book is going to be 7 years hence, so don't hold your breath. I would say that, I'm a fellow at Cambridge. I have a little website there. I have a personal website, which I never update. And I try to, belatedly, I've been moved to, the academic Twitter, and I'm not very good at it. Other academics are fantastic at it, and are really sort of working at being public intellectuals on Twitter, responding moment to moment on things that happen and on articles that are published. And I'm very bad at that. But on my Twitter, I do usually announce if I'm about to speak on something or if I've just published something. So maybe maybe my Twitter's the best. I don't even know if I remember my handle. Hold on. Wait, I think it's somewhere here.
Yeah, we can link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, it is. I am Nicole C_Aboitiz. So there you go.
Okay. And then I guess as we close this out, I think you would be in a uniquely good position to dispense this advice, because historians definitely look at things from a longer time scale. So we understand that what is happening now is just part of kind of a broader unfolding of events, no? So what can we learn from this moment in history, or what have we learned from similar moments in history that we can tell ourselves to get through this current pandemic situation?
So I'm going to come out of this one by saying that for Toynbee, we did a fantastic coronavirus series where I interviewed and hosted roundtables with the leading global historical experts around the world. And we have a fantastic series on it online. And it's multidimensional. We have, sort of archival photographs, we have videos, and we have short Q&As. The one I did with Dipesh Chakrabarty, I think, is the most important of that series. I really, really like its sort of zoonotic perspective. And then there's also, leading experts on the international talking about what this pretends for internationalism and all sorts. So I would suggest that people go there.
Sure, I'll get the link from you and put it in the show notes as well. Right. What about what you would say to somebody who's looking at the headlines and the way our news is reported now? It's very immediate. What would you say is an antidote to the immediacy of our news cycles? Maybe how can we learn from the historians, and maybe for our mental health, learn to consider things in a broader perspective and let them unfold in the fullness of time, I think, as you said in one interview.
Yeah. I don't know. I think everyone has a different sort of temperament and register and a way in which, they prefer to interact with the world around them. And mine is generally slower. I found that, at least just for my pace, it doesn't help me to be kind of checking Twitter every second for the new thought piece, the new declaration, and I like to sort of read my news more like once a week to collect everything, so it's not so heated in the moment, except when there are very big important things happening. So with the storming of the Capitol, I went into like a 3-day black hole where I didn't do anything else but read about that and watch videos and be on Twitter all day, all night. So I think immersion is good, but I also try to step back in my normal day-to-day life and have and read the news at my own pace.
Sure, I think that's sage advice. Especially now, because there's so much content being thrown at us. I think it would do well to maybe take a pause and look at it once a week, except for certain more urgent activities. No, so yeah, I've really appreciated your sharing your perspective with us, and I can't wait to hear the coronavirus series that you did with the Toynbee Institute. I think the work you're doing is extremely vital. And I hope that moving forward, you and others like you continue to get the support that you need from all sectors to continue to do the work you do.
Thank you so much. I feel very lucky to be very well supported. So I hope that other people get supported. I've been very privileged. So yeah, I hope that access can go much further than just Ivory Tower.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Jo.
Bye.
Bye.